The narrator reached the edge of the village at a moment when the day seemed unsure whether it wanted to end. The sky hung low and heavy, painted in dull shades of fading orange and gray, as if the sun itself was reluctant to disappear. The road that led there was narrow, cracked, and uneven, winding through empty land that looked untouched for years. Tall grass grew wild on both sides, brushing softly against his legs with every step, producing a faint whispering sound that made him feel less alone, and yet more uneasy. There were no birds, no insects, no distant sounds of life, only the quiet crunch of dirt and stone beneath his boots, echoing too loudly in the stillness. As he slowed his pace, an unfamiliar pressure settled in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a sense of being watched long before he could see anyone. The village emerged gradually, almost shyly, as if revealing itself only when it decided he was close enough. Small stone houses stood close together, their shapes softened by age, their walls darkened by time and weather. There were no fences, no gates, no clear boundary marking where the outside world ended and the village began. One step forward, and it felt as though he had crossed into something separate, something sealed off from the rest of reality. The air itself felt different here, thicker, heavier, carrying a strange stillness that clung to his skin. Even the breeze seemed hesitant, moving only in short, uncertain breaths. He paused for a moment, telling himself he was simply tired from the journey, yet his instincts refused to settle. It felt as though the village had noticed him the instant he arrived, not with urgency or aggression, but with quiet attention, like something ancient opening its eyes after a long wait. There were no welcoming signs, no distant voices calling out, no indication that travelers were expected or even common. And yet, the narrator could not shake the feeling that his arrival was not a coincidence. Standing there beneath the dimming sky, with the road behind him already fading into shadow, he felt an unsettling certainty take root in his mind. This place had been waiting, not for someone specific, but for someone. And now that he had arrived, turning back felt strangely unthinkable. As the narrator took his first careful steps into the village, the unnatural order of the place became impossible to ignore. Lamps glowed warmly from nearly every window, their light steady and unwavering, as if they had been lit hours ago in careful preparation. It was strange. Night had only just begun to settle, yet the village behaved as though darkness were an old, familiar guest that required no adjustment. The soft yellow light spilled onto the cobblestones, stretching into long, clean shadows that did not flicker away firelight normally does. Everything appeared calm, controlled, and deliberately arranged. The houses stood close together, built from stone darkened by age, their surfaces worn smooth by time rather than neglect. Wooden doors were left slightly open, not wide enough to invite entry, but not closed enough to signal privacy either. It gave the narrator the unsettling impression that nothing here was meant to be hidden, only observed. As he passed each home, he became acutely aware of how sound behaved strangely in the village. His footsteps echoed too clearly, bouncing back at him from walls and corners, as if the streets themselves were listening and responding. Villagers moved through the streets with an ease that felt rehearsed. A man adjusted a lantern with slow, exact movements, making sure it was perfectly aligned before stepping back. A woman carried a basket across the road, her pace unhurried, her posture straight, her eyes focused forward with unnatural clarity. Children sat on stone steps or leaned against walls, speaking softly among themselves, their voices controlled and precise. What disturbed the narrator most was not their calm behavior, but the complete absence of tiredness. No drooping shoulders, no heavy steps, no signs of a long day coming to an end. As he continued walking, he noticed that the villagers' attention shifted subtly when he passed. Conversations lowered in volume, but did not stop. Eyes followed him briefly, not with curiosity or suspicion, but with something closer to recognition. It felt less like he was being noticed the first time, and more like he was being acknowledged, as though his presence confirmed something the village already knew. The narrator tried to dismiss the feeling, telling himself he was imagining things, yet the tightness in his chest refused to ease. There was a rhythm to the village, an invisible order guiding every movement, every pause, every breath. Even the silence felt structured, carefully maintained. standing there under the steady lamplight, surrounded by people who seemed unaffected by the coming night. The narrator realized that this was not a place that reacted to darkness. This was a place that had learned to live inside it. And as he moved deeper into the village, a quiet thought settled uncomfortably in his mind. Whatever rules governed this place, they were not meant for someone who still needed sleep. The narrator slowed his pace as he moved further into the village, becoming increasingly aware of how differently time seemed to behave here. Minutes felt stretched, elongated, as though the night itself was reluctant to move forward. The soft glow of the lamps did not flicker or dim. Instead, they shone with an unnerving consistency, casting shadows that appeared too sharp, too deliberate. The narrator found himself watching these shadows more closely than the villagers themselves, noticing how they stretched along the walls and ground, sometimes lingering even after their owners had moved on. What unsettled him most was the villagers' faces. Their expressions were calm, composed, and strangely empty of exhaustion. Their eyes were wide open, clear and focused, reflecting the lamplight without the dullness that usually comes with a long day. He saw no redness, no heaviness, no signs of fatigue. Even the elderly walked with straight backs and steady steps, their movements slow but controlled, as though sleep had never been part of their lives. The children, too, showed no restlessness, no yawns or complaints, sitting quietly for long stretches of time, their attention sharp and unwavering. As he passed through a narrow street, he noticed how conversations seemed to flow around him without ever including him. Words were spoken softly, carefully chosen, never rising above a murmur. Whenever he tried to focus on what was being said, the voices blended together, becoming indistinct, as if the village did not want him to hear too much too soon. Occasionally, a sentence would stop abruptly when he came too close, replaced by silence so sudden it made his heartbeat feel loud and intrusive. The narrator began to feel a subtle pressure building in his head, a dull ache behind his eyes that came not from pain, but from prolonged alertness. His body was used to slowing down at night, preparing for rest, yet the village seemed to resist that natural rhythm. The longer he remained there, the more he felt his own sense of time slipping out of alignment, pulled into a pattern that demanded constant awareness. It was exhausting in a way he had never experienced before, not physical exhaustion, but mental strain, like being forced to keep one's eyes open against instinct. He noticed that even simple actions were performed with care and repetition, as though the villagers were following routines practiced over generations. A door was closed, then reopened slightly. A lantern was adjusted, checked, and adjusted again. A path was walked back and forth, slowly, methodically, without purpose he could understand. These actions felt less like habits and more like rituals. Small, precise movements designed to maintain balance, order, and control. As he stood there, watching these subtle performances unfold around him, a disturbing realization crept into his thoughts. This village was not merely awake. It was disciplined in its wakefulness. Staying alert here was not a choice or a habit. It was a rule, enforced not through fear or command, but through a shared understanding that had been passed down for centuries. And though no one had spoken a word to him about sleep, the message was already clear. In this place, sleep was not a necessity. It was a risk. As the narrator ventured deeper into the village, he became more aware of faint, persistent sound threading through the still night air, a low, continuous hum that seemed almost alive. At first, he tried to dismiss it as the wind passing through crooked streets or some distant animal. Yet the moment he focused on it, the hum revealed a deliberate rhythm, subtle but undeniable, vibrating softly through the air, the cobblestones beneath his boots, and even through the very bones in his chest. It was not coming from any visible source. There were no lanterns, no pipes, no signs of machinery. The hum existed everywhere at once, enveloping him in a sensation that was part sound, part pulse, part intangible awareness. He paused, letting the silence of the village press against him, and realized that the hum seemed to respond to his own presence. When he stopped, it softened, almost as if listening. When he moved, it pulsed in harmony with his steps. It was as though the village itself were alive, breathing, aware of his intrusion, guiding his movements with subtle, imperceptible nudges. The thought made his skin prickle. He glanced at the villagers, walking with deliberate precision, their faces calm, their eyes unerringly alert. They paid no attention to hum at all, moving as though it were part of the fabric of their existence, something they had long since internalized, accepted, and perhaps even depended upon. The narrator's senses sharpened under the influence of the hum. Colors seemed heightened, shadows deepened, and every small detail, the worn texture of the doorframe, the uneven edges of the cobblestones, the faint tilt of a window shutter, became unnervingly pronounced. The hum seemed to guide his attention, directing his gaze toward things he might otherwise overlook, making him hyper-aware of the village's meticulous design. The more he noticed, the more he felt an almost imperceptible pressure on his mind, urging him to stay alert, to watch, to measure, to endure. It was exhausting in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. It was a strain on his very consciousness, a quiet compulsion that resisted every natural urge to relax. He realized that the villagers' own movements were synchronized with the hum in subtle ways. A man straightened a lantern, pausing momentarily to glance toward the narrator before continuing, his movements almost ritualistic. Children sat perfectly still, whispering softly, yet their voices merged with the hum in a way that made the sound feel layered, alive, and impossibly complex. Even the animals, though scarce, moved with a quiet attentiveness, never startling, never breaking the rhythm. Everything in the village appeared connected, a single, living organism that moved, breathed, and observed with infinite patience. The longer he walked, the more the hum became intertwined with his own awareness. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat, threading through his thoughts, insisting that he remain fully conscious. His eyes grew heavy, yet he could not close them. Fatigue gnawed at his limbs, but the village's presence, communicated silently through the hum, demanded vigilance. In that moment, he understood the terrifying truth. Sleep in his village was not a simple rest. It was a danger. The hum existed to enforce alertness, to erase the possibility of surrender, to keep the people awake, connected, and aware. Every flicker of exhaustion, every lapse of focus, seemed almost detectable, almost measurable by the unseen rhythm that bound the village together. A cold realization gripped him. This sound was more than background noise. It was a mechanism of control, subtle and pervasive, stretching through streets, walls, and even the villagers themselves. It was patient, quiet, relentless, and ancient, an invisible hand pressing upon the minds of anyone who entered. The narrator shivered as he grasped the magnitude of it. He had stepped into a place that had existed for centuries, a place that had learned to survive through vigilance, through endurance, through unbroken wakefulness. And now he was part of it. In the dim lamplight, with the hum threading through every corner of the village and vibrating within him, he felt a deep, almost physical pull. This village did not simply resist sleep. It demanded it, monitored it, and punished its absence. And for the first time, he realized that the night he had stepped into would not end until he understood this rule fully, until he surrendered to the relentless rhythm, or became lost within it entirely. As the narrator continued walking through the winding streets of the village, he began noticing subtler details, things that first seemed inconsequential, but gradually wove together into a tapestry of unease. Every motion, every breath, every step of the villagers carried a strange precision. A man paused mid-step to adjust a stone that was slightly out of place on the path, his movement deliberate and unnervingly exact. A woman bent over her doorstep, arranging small pebbles in a neat line, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Not from fatigue, but from a ritualistic necessity that the narrator could not yet comprehend. The children, who had seemed almost statuesque in their composure, whispered softly in tones that harmonized with the faint hum threading through the night, creating a rhythm that seemed almost alive. The narrator's awareness sharpened with each passing moment, every sense alert to the slightest irregularity. He noticed that the shadows themselves moved differently here. They stretched too long, shifted too smoothly, and occasionally seemed to drift independently of their owners, as though the village itself were bending reality, subtly testing his perception. The gentle flicker of a lantern's flame seemed to hold him in place for a heartbeat longer than natural, and a distant sound, a door closing, a floorboard creaking, resonated with an unnatural echo, reminding him that he was being watched in ways he could not fully perceive. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary village. It was alive, patient, and aware. Fatigue clawed at him, creeping into his muscles, making every step heavier, every breath slower. Yet the village's presence, conveyed through subtle motions, the synchronized hum, and the unblinking vigilance of the people around him, refused to allow even a moment's surrender. His eyelids felt like stone, his chest tight, his mind fighting against the body's primal need to rest. And still he moved forward, compelled by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and the inescapable sense that the village expected him to endure, to remain awake, to become part of the rhythm itself. The longer he observed, the more he realized that nothing in the village was random. Each action, however small, each pause or glance, was part of a pattern that had been maintained for generations. The villagers had perfected the art of perpetual awareness. Even when they spoke to one another, it was with precise timing, carefully measured tones, an almost imperceptible rhythm that harmonized with a hum lingering in the air. The narrator began to feel that he was both intruder and participant simultaneously, caught in a space that demanded both attention and restraint, where failure to notice even the smallest detail could have unknown consequences. As he passed through a small courtyard, he noticed the air seemed heavier here, denser, almost tactile. Every sound, every movement, every flicker of light seemed amplified, resonating with a weight that pressed against his mind. It was as if the village itself were slowly enveloping him, testing the limits of his endurance, shaping his perception, and subtly bending his consciousness to align with its own relentless rhythm. The gentle hum, now more insistent, seemed to pull at his thoughts, threading them into the same careful, measured awareness that had governed the villagers for centuries. A creeping, almost tangible dread settled into his chest. He understood now that this village did not merely discourage sleep. It had learned to survive through vigilance, through endless wakefulness, through an unbroken connection to something older and infinitely patient. And as he walked, he could feel the pull, soft, constant, inexorable, drawing him deeper into the village's secrets, binding him to the rhythm, the hum, and the unblinking, ever-watchful eyes that measured his every heartbeat, his every thought. By the time he stopped for a brief moment in the center of the courtyard, the narrator realized he had become fully aware of the village's quiet insistence. Sleep was a vulnerability. Rest was forbidden, and the night, with all its shadows and hums, was alive in a way that would not release him easily. And in that realization, a cold certainty washed over him. This night was only the beginning, and the village's watchful presence would follow him, thread by thread, until the very last shadow of consciousness had been claimed. The narrator moved deeper into the village, every step weighed down by a growing awareness that he was no longer simply passing through. It was as if the village itself had begun to fold him into its rhythm. Each stone beneath his feet seemed deliberate, every flicker of lamplight purposeful, every hushed murmur of the villagers threading into the low, persistent hum that now vibrated through his chest. His senses were on high alert. The air felt thick with unseen presence, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in subtle ways, as if alive and observant. He could feel the village measuring him, judging him, testing his endurance, and he understood that every small lapse of attention would not go unnoticed. Fatigue pressed relentlessly against him, a dull, gnawing ache in his muscles and eyes, yet he could not allow himself to falter. Every instinct told him to rest, to sit, even for a moment, but the villagers moved around her without pause, their eyes clear, their motions precise, and he realized that even the slightest surrender to exhaustion might bring consequences he could not yet imagine. The low hum seemed to tighten, threading through his mind, almost guiding his thoughts in alignment with the village's pulse. It was hypnotic and disorienting, yet impossible to resist. He noticed patterns in the villagers' routines he had missed before, the precise spacing of their steps, the rhythmic gestures that synchronized with one another, the subtle glances that communicated information without a single word. The village was alive, conscious in a way that defied understanding, and he, as a newcomer, was being drawn into its web of eternal wakefulness. Every instinct within him screamed that sleep here was dangerous, that rest was forbidden, and that the night held a weight far heavier than he had ever known. Standing in the center of the village square, he paused, trying to collect his thoughts, to understand what he had witnessed so far. But comprehension slipped through his mind like water. The patterns, the hum, the ever-watchful eyes. It was impossible to grasp fully, impossible to escape. And yet, he could feel the night pressing closer, shadows lengthening, hum deepening, guiding him toward a deeper understanding he was not yet ready for. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat aligned with the silent, patient expectation of the village. The narrator realized with a growing, chilling certainty that this night was only the beginning of a test, one that would continue, layer upon layer, as long as he remained in this place. He had survived the initial entry, endured the first subtle trials, and now the deeper truths awaited him. The village had drawn him in fully, and there would be no relief until he confronted the reality of what it meant to exist within its eternal wakefulness. And as he took a cautious step toward the narrow path that led further into the village, the hum vibrating in perfect alignment with his heartbeat, he understood that the next stage of this night, the next revelation, the next layer of truth, was about to unfold. It was here at the subtle threshold that the story would continue, and the narrator felt simultaneously both dread and compulsion. With that realization, the night seemed to stretch ahead, pulling him forward, and the first moments of step 2 quietly began to stir in the shadows around him. The path leading away from the village square was narrower than the streets behind him, its edges uneven, as though it had been carved not for comfort but for guidance. The narrator followed it without fully understanding why, drawn forward by the same quiet force that had governed every movement since his arrival. The low hum did not fade as he moved. It deepened, settling into a steadier rhythm that seemed to pull him onward, step by deliberate step. The lamplight grew sparser here, leaving wider stretches of shadow between each pool of light, and within those shadows, the air felt heavier, denser, as though something unseen lingered just beyond sight. As he walked, the presence of the villagers diminished, their soft movements and murmured routines fading into the distance. Yet he never felt alone. The silence here carried weight, pressing against his ears, filling the spaces where sound should have been. His senses sharpened further, every faint shift in the air, every subtle vibration beneath his feet, demanding attention. The village no longer observed him openly. Instead, it watched from within, through the hum, through the ground, through the shadows that stretched unnaturally along the path. Fatigue returned with renewed force, heavier now, more insistent. His body begged for rest, his thoughts slowing, yet his mind remained painfully alert, held awake by an invisible pressure that refused to loosen its grip. He realized that this path was not merely leading him deeper into the village. It was drawing him deeper into its rules, its truths, its unspoken demands. Each step felt like a commitment, a silent agreement to continue, even as the cost of staying awake grew more unbearable. The narrator noticed subtle signs along the path. Faint markings etched into stone, lantern hooks left empty, yet still warm to the touch, and doorways half hidden behind shadowed walls. These were not abandoned places. They were prepared, waiting, as though they existed for moments that had not yet arrived. The realization sent a chill through him. This village planned for wakefulness, anticipated endurance, and shaped every path to ensure that no one ever truly escaped its watchful grasp. As the path curved slightly, disappearing into a deeper stretch of darkness, the hum grew more insistent, pressing against his thoughts with quiet urgency. The narrator felt a shift within himself, a sense that whatever he had experienced so far was only the surface. The true nature of the village, the reason sleep was forbidden, waited just ahead. And though fear tightened in his chest, he continued forward, knowing that turning back would offer no relief. With each step into narrowing shadows, the village seemed to close around him, guiding him toward the next stage of the night, toward answers he was not ready for and consequences he could no longer avoid. As the narrator continued along the narrowing path, he began to notice that the village no longer felt like a collection of buildings and people. It felt like a single, unified presence, quietly enclosing him. The air grew noticeably colder, not in a sharp or sudden way, but gradually, as though warmth itself was being withdrawn with intention. Each breath felt heavier than the last, settling deep in his lungs and refusing to leave easily. The hum, once distant and ambient, now pressed closer, vibrating faintly behind his ears, threading itself into his thoughts until it was impossible to tell where the sound ended and his own awareness began. The shadows along the path behaved strangely. They did not simply stretch with the lamplight. They lingered, pooling unnaturally in corners, clinging to doorways and stone walls as if reluctant to let go. At times, the narrator was certain they shifted when he was not looking directly at them, adjusting their shapes to follow his movement. He slowed his pace, heart pounding, acutely aware that even the darkness here felt alert. This was not a place where shadows hid things. This was a place where shadows watched. He noticed doorways lining the path, each one slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. No sounds came from inside. No breathing, no movement, no sign of life. Yet the narrator could not shake the feeling that these spaces were occupied, prepared, waiting. The door frames were worn smooth, as if hands had passed over them countless times, not in comfort, but in ritual. The realization crept into his mind slowly and with dread. These were not homes meant for rest. They were places of endurance, built for those who never slept. Fatigue surged through him in waves, stronger now, more aggressive. His vision blurred for a moment, edges of the world softening as his body desperately sought rest. Instantly, the hum intensified, pressing against his skull like a warning. His eyes snapped open fully, his heartbeat quickening, his awareness painfully sharp once more. The village would not allow even the smallest surrender. It reacted to weakness. It corrected it. The narrator felt something shift inside him, a growing understanding that this place was actively shaping him, molding his thoughts, his instincts, his very perception of time. Minutes stretched endlessly, yet passed without relief. His sense of direction faltered. The path seemed longer than it should have been, bending subtly, looping just enough to disorient him. He realized with horror that exhaustion here was not a byproduct of the night. It was part of the design. As he reached the end of the path, where the lamplight thinned into near darkness, the narrator paused, dread settling deep in his chest. He understood now that the village was not simply keeping its people awake. It was teaching them how to survive without sleep, and with every step forward, it was teaching him too, whether he wanted to learn or not. The hum steadied, patient and unyielding, as if acknowledging his progress. Whatever waited ahead would demand more than awareness. It would demand endurance. The narrator stepped beyond the last stretch of lamplight, and the village seemed to respond immediately. The hum did not grow louder, yet it felt closer, more intimate, like a presence leaning in to listen. The darkness ahead was not empty. It was layered, dense, and deliberate. His eyes struggled to adjust, not because there was no light, but because the shadows seemed to absorb it, bending illumination into unnatural shapes that refused to settle into anything familiar. The path beneath his feet felt narrower now, less defined, as though the village no longer felt the need to guide him gently. He began to notice movement at the edges of his vision, slight, uncertain shifts that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. Not figures, not shadows exactly, more like impressions, suggestions of something standing just out of reach of sight. His instincts screamed that he was no longer alone, yet there was no sound to confirm it. No footsteps, no breathing, just the steady hum and the weight of being observed without witnesses. Time lost its structure here. The narrator could not tell how long he had been walking. Minutes and hours blurred together into a single, exhausting stretch of awareness. His thoughts slowed, drifting dangerously close to the edge of sleep, and the moment they did, a sharp pulse in the hum snapped his focus back into place. It felt corrective, punitive, as though the village itself rejected the very concept of mental rest. His mind was not allowed to wander. It was not allowed to dim. He felt memories rising unbidden. Brief flashes of beds, closed eyes, quiet rooms, the comfort surrendering to sleep. Each memory brought with it a sudden spike of dread, followed by the hum tightening its grip, pressing those thoughts back into silence. The realization struck him hard. Sleep was not merely forbidden here. It was remembered as a threat, something that had once gone terribly wrong. As he slowed, his legs trembling from exhaustion, he noticed markings along the stone walls, etched symbols worn smooth by time. They were not decorative. They repeated at measured intervals, carved with careful precision, as if counting something. Hours, breaths, heartbeats, endurance. The narrator traced one with his fingers and felt warmth beneath the stone, as though the wall itself was alive, alert, and aware of his touch. He recoiled, heart racing. A distant sound reached him then, not the hum, but something beneath it, a faint, rhythmic whispering. Too soft to understand, rising and falling in uneven waves. It did not come from any single direction. It surrounded him. He strained to listen, hoping for words, for meaning, for proof that this was human. But the sounds never resolved into language. They remained fragments, broken murmurs, echoes of voices that had long forgotten how to rest. The narrator's fear deepened into something heavier, inevitability. He understood now that the village did not trap people physically. It trapped them through endurance, through nights that never ended, through a slow reshaping of the mind, until wakefulness became the only possible state of existence. This place did not need walls or guards. Time itself was the prison. His steps slowed further, exhaustion finally threatening to overwhelm even the village's control. His vision blurred, his thoughts fractured, and for one terrifying moment, his eyes began to close. The hum surged, not louder, stronger. It vibrated through his skull, through his spine, forcing his eyes open, dragging his awareness back into brutal clarity. He gasped, stumbling forward, heart pounding violently. The village had corrected him again. As he steadied himself, breathing hard, the narrator understood with chilling certainty. This was no longer about observation or curiosity. The village was testing how long he could remain awake. And somewhere ahead, beyond the darkness, beyond the markings, beyond the whispers, waited the reason this test existed at all. Whatever demanded this endless wakefulness was still watching. And it was not patient for Eve. The narrator finally reached a wider clearing where the path opened into a circular space surrounded by tall, windowless structures. The moment he stepped into it, the hum changed, not in volume, but in texture. It felt denser, heavier, as though the sound had thickened into something almost physical. The air here pressed against his skin, making every breath feel deliberate and measured, as if the village itself were controlling the pace at which he inhaled and exhaled. There was no wind, yet the sensation of movement lingered, like something unseen passing just behind him, close enough to disturb the air, but never close enough to be seen. In the center of the clearing stood a structure unlike the others, shorter, wider, and built from darker stone. Its surface was smooth, worn not by weather but by touch, as though countless hands had brushed against over time. The narrator felt an instinctive pull toward it, a quiet compulsion that made resistance feel pointless. As he approached, the hum aligned perfectly with his heartbeat, each pulse reinforcing the next, blurring the boundary between sound and self. He felt exposed here, as though every thought, every flicker of doubt or fatigue, was being quietly observed and recorded. The silence around the structure was absolute. No footsteps echoed. No distant whispers followed him here. Even the village seemed to hold its breath. The narrator noticed faint impressions carved into the stone, handprints layered over one another, some small, some large, all worn smooth. They were not marks of panic or struggle. They were marks of endurance, of people who had stood here for long periods of time, awake, waiting, refusing to surrender to rest. A sudden wave of exhaustion nearly brought him to his knees. His vision narrowed, edges darkening, thoughts dissolving into fragments. For a moment, he felt a dangerous calm, the seductive promise of letting go, of closing his eyes just for a second. Instantly, the hum surged inward, no longer surrounding him but vibrating through him, sharp and corrective. His muscles tensed, his breath hitched, and his eyes flew open. The village would not allow weakness here. This place was designed to confront it. As he steadied himself, the narrator realized something far more disturbing than the village's control over sleep. This place was not merely preventing rest. It was preparing him, conditioning him. Every step, every surge of fatigue, every forced moment of clarity was shaping his mind towards something specific. The structure before him was not a warning. It was an invitation, a threshold between simple endurance and understanding the true cost of staying awake. The hum settled again, calm and patient, as if satisfied with his response. The narrator stood there, trembling but alert, knowing that whatever lay beyond this moment would explain why the village feared sleep more than death itself. And as he took a cautious step closer to the dark stone structure, he felt the final traces of the outside world slipping away, replaced by a singular, terrifying truth. The village did not keep people awake to survive the night. It kept them awake so something else never had to. The narrator stepped fully into the circular clearing, and in that instant, the village seemed to retreat, not physically but consciously. The streets behind him no longer felt connected to this place, as though he had crossed an invisible boundary where ordinary rules no longer applied. The hum shifted again, stretching longer between pulses, slower but heavier, pressing against his mind with a weight that made thought itself feel effortful. Each vibration felt deliberate, measured, as though something unseen was counting his breaths, his heartbeats, his endurance. The air inside the clearing was unnaturally still. Not silent, never silent, but controlled. It wrapped around him tightly, warm and oppressive, carrying the faint scent of old stone and something else beneath it, something organic. The narrator became painfully aware of his own body. The ache in his legs, the dryness in his eyes, the trembling tension in his jaw from holding it clenched for too long. His exhaustion was no longer subtle. It was overwhelming, pressing down on him like a physical force. Yet even here, even now, sleep felt impossibly distant, like a memory from another life. The dark stone structure at the center of the clearing loomed closer than it should have. Its surface absorbed the dim light around it, refusing reflection, refusing clarity. The narrator felt drawn toward it, not by curiosity alone, but by a deeper compulsion, an unspoken instruction that settled into his thoughts without language. This was not a place one stumbled upon. It was a place one was brought to. As he approached, the markings on the structure became clearer. Handprints overlapped each other in countless layers, worn smooth by repetition rather than force. Some were small, almost delicate. Others were large, rough, and deeply pressed into stone. These were not marks of fear or desperation. They were marks of waiting, of standing awake for long hours, perhaps days, perhaps longer, hands pressed against cold stone in quiet submission. The narrator felt a sudden wave of nausea as he realized these prints were not memorials. They were records. His vision blurred again, the edges darkening as exhaustion surged violently through him. His knees buckled slightly, and for the first time since entering the village, he felt himself begin to slip. Thoughts fractured, time distorted. The hum faltered for a split second, then it struck him, not as sound, but as pressure. A force surged inward, sharp and corrective, slamming awareness back into place. His eyes snapped open wide, breath tearing from his lungs in a ragged gasp. Pain flared behind his eyes, his muscles tensing violently as his body was forced back into absolute wakefulness. The village had intervened, not out of cruelty, but necessity. The narrator staggered forward, bracing himself against a stone structure. The surface was warm beneath his palms. Too warm. He froze. Stone should not feel alive. Yet beneath his hands, he felt a faint vibration, subtle but unmistakable, as though something deep within the structure was responding to his presence. Listening. Memories flooded his mind without warning. Images of beds, darkness behind closed eyes, the gentle release of surrender. Each memory brought with it an overwhelming sense of danger, followed instantly by the hum tightening, pushing those thoughts away. He understood now with horrifying clarity. Sleep was not forbidden because it was weakness. Sleep was forbidden because it invited something. The narrator slowly pulled his hands away from the structure, heart pounding violently. He looked around the clearing again and noticed details he had missed before. The surrounding buildings were not homes. They had no windows, no doors meant for comfort. They were watch posts, stations of endurance, places where villagers stood night after night, ensuring that whatever dwelled beneath the village remained undisturbed. This was not a village built to protect its people. It was a village built to protect the world from what lay below it. The hum softened again, settling into a steady rhythm, as though acknowledging his understanding. The narrator felt something change, not in the village, but in himself. The confusion that had plagued him since his arrival began to fade, replaced by a heavy, dreadful clarity. He was no longer merely being observed. He was being prepared, tested, aligned. The stone structure before him was not the source. It was a seal, and seals required watchers. As the narrator stood there, trembling but fully awake, he became aware of movement beyond the clearing, shapes emerging slowly from the darkness, silent and disciplined. Villagers were approaching, not hurried, not fearful, but purposeful. Their eyes were clear, their faces calm. They had done this before, many times. The hum deepened one final time, spreading outward, rolling to the clearing like controlled breath. The narrator realized with chilling certainty that the next stage would not be about wandering or observing. It would be about participation, about learning the truth behind the endless wakefulness. And as the villagers stepped closer, forming a quiet circle around him, the narrator understood that step 2 had ended, and what awaited him next would finally explain why no one in this village ever sleeps. Somewhere beneath his feet, something shifted. The villagers did not speak as they stepped into the clearing. They moved slowly, deliberately, their footsteps perfectly synchronized with the deepened rhythm of the hum. One by one, they formed a wide circle around the narrator, leaving just enough space for him to breathe, but not enough to feel free. Their faces were calm, too calm, devoid of fear, urgency, or hesitation. These were not people reacting to an emergency. These were people performing something long rehearsed. The narrator felt an overwhelming pressure settle over him, not from the villagers themselves, but from the understanding that had finally begun to surface. This was not the first time someone had stood where he now stood. The circle, the structure, the silence, it all existed for moments like this, for nights like this. His heart pounded violently, yet the hum wrapped around it, regulating its rhythm, forcing it into alignment. Even panic, it seemed, was not entirely his own anymore. One of the villagers stepped forward slightly, not close enough to touch him, but close enough to be unmistakably present. Their eyes met briefly, and in that instant, the narrator saw something deeply unsettling. Not emptiness, not madness, but resolve. A quiet, terrible acceptance forged through years, perhaps generations, of endless wakefulness. These people were not prisoners. They were guardians. The hum shifted again, and this time the narrator felt it move through the ground beneath his feet. The stone structure behind him vibrated faintly, responding like a living thing stirred from shallow rest. The villagers raised their heads almost imperceptibly, as if listening to something deeper, something older than sound. The narrator followed their gaze downward, toward the earth itself, and a cold realization took hold. The village had not been built on land. It had been built over something. Memories that were not his own brushed against his thoughts. Fleeting impressions of ancient nights, of torches burning until dawn, of people standing awake in silence while the ground beneath them pulsed and shifted. These were not visions meant to be understood fully. They were warnings, fragments of history etched into the collective awareness of the village, passed down not through stories, but through endurance. The narrator's exhaustion surged violently, stronger than ever before. His body screamed for rest, his thoughts fraying at the edges, consciousness threatening to collapse under its own weight. For a moment, a single, terrifying moment, he wondered if surrender might be easier, if closing his eyes might finally bring peace. The response was immediate. The hum intensified sharply, surging to the clearing like controlled shock. His vision snapped into painful clarity, muscles locking, breath catching in his throat. The villagers did not flinch. They had seen this moment countless times before. This was the point where most failed. This was the point where the truth could no longer be denied. A voice finally broke the silence, not spoken aloud, but carried to the hum itself, vibrating directly into the narrator's awareness. It was not a command. It was not a threat. It was an explanation. Sleep, the voice conveyed, was not dangerous because of what it took away, but because of what it allowed in. Long ago, something beneath the village had learned to listen for the absence of awareness. When minds dimmed, when vigilance faltered, it stirred. Dreams were not harmless here. They were invitations. And once invited, the thing below did not leave unchanged. The narrator felt his breath tremble as the weight of his knowledge settled into him. The endless wakefulness, the rituals, the hum, the guardianship. It all existed to maintain one fragile rule. Someone must always be awake, not watching the creature below, but preventing it from dreaming through them. The villagers did not fear exhaustion. They feared being used. As the understanding locked into place, the narrator realized something far more horrifying than the village's secret. They had not brought him here to witness the truth. They had brought him here to decide. The silence that followed the unspoken explanation was heavier than anything the narrator had felt before. It pressed against his thoughts, filling every space where denial might have existed. The villagers remained still, their presence forming a quiet boundary around him, not as captors, but as witnesses. This moment did not require chains or force. Understanding itself was a restraint. The hum softened slightly, no longer corrective, no longer sharp, but watchful, patient, like something waiting to see what choice would be made. The narrator's mind struggled to process the enormity of what he had learned. The idea that sleep, something so natural, so essential, could become a doorway rather than a refuge shattered everything he thought he understood about rest, about dreams, about safety. He realized that the village's endless wakefulness was not born from superstition or madness, but from experience, from loss, from nights where vigilance had failed and consequences had followed. Whatever lay beneath the village had learned humanity's oldest weakness, the moment when consciousness loosens its grip. A subtle movement rippled through the circle of villagers. One of them stepped forward, not with authority, but with quiet gravity. Their face was lined with age, yet their eyes were painfully clear, sharper than any he had seen since arriving. When they looked at him, there was no judgment there, only recognition. The recognition of someone standing at the same threshold they once had. The narrator understood then that every person in this village had faced this moment. This was not a punishment reserved for outsiders. It was a responsibility passed down, generation after generation. The hum shifted again, and the ground beneath his feet responded with a faint vibration. Images pressed against his thoughts, visions not fully formed, but emotionally overwhelming. He felt the presence beneath the village stir faintly, not waking, but turning in its restless containment. It was vast, ancient, not malicious in the way stories describe monsters, but indifferent in a way far more terrifying. It did not hate humanity. It barely acknowledged it, except as a medium, a bridge between dreaming and reality. The narrator's exhaustion peaked again, crashing over him like a wave. His body trembled, his muscles burning with the effort of staying upright, his thoughts fractured, words dissolving before they could fully form. He felt himself slipping toward the edge of sleep, toward the forbidden softness of unconsciousness. And in that moment, he understood why this role destroyed so many. Wakefulness here was not passive. It was a constant battle against one's own nature. The villagers did not intervene immediately. They watched. This, too, was part of the process. The narrator felt the hum tense, coiling like a restrained force, ready to correct him if he fell too far. But beneath that restraint, he sensed something else, a question. Could he endure without being forced? Could he choose vigilance over relief? His knees nearly gave way. He reached out instinctively, steadying himself against a dark stone structure. The vibration beneath his palm was stronger now, unmistakable. Whatever lay sealed below was aware of him. Not awake, but aware. A presence brushing against the edges of consciousness, testing the boundary, sensing the unfamiliar mind above it. The narrator's breath came in ragged gasps as fear and understanding merged into something heavier, responsibility. The villagers began a low, synchronized motion, not words, not gestures, but collective shift of posture, aligning themselves with the hum. The narrator realized this was a ritual, not marked by chants or symbols, but by endurance, by standing awake together, by refusing to let the boundary weaken. The village did not worship what lay beneath. It opposed it through vigilance, through denial of the one thing it needed to reach outward. A realization struck him with brutal clarity. This village did not survive because no one slept. No one slept because if everyone ever did, even once, the world beyond this place would never wake again. The weight of that truth crushed down on him. The village was a lock. The people were the key. And sleep was the turning motion that must never be completed. The narrator understood now why outsiders were rare, why those who arrived did not always leave. This was not a secret meant to be known widely. Knowledge itself carried risk. The fewer who knew, the fewer who might accidentally invite the thing below through dreams. The hum softened further, settling into a slow, steady rhythm, no longer pressing, no longer correcting. It was waiting. The villagers' eyes turned toward the narrator in unison. No words were spoken, but the choice was unmistakable. He could leave. Eventually, the village would guide him back, erase what it could, let him go with fragments of unease and unanswered questions. Or he could stay, stand awake, take his place in the endless watch. His exhaustion screamed at him to run, to reject this madness. To flee before the night consumed him entirely. But beneath that instinct was another feeling, quieter, heavier, more dangerous. Purpose, the terrible clarity of being needed, the understanding that his presence here was not accidental, that something beneath the village had noticed him long before he arrived. The narrator lifted his head slowly, forcing his eyes to remain open, forcing his thoughts into focus. The hum responded, steady and approving, as though acknowledging his effort. The villagers did not smile. They did not nod. They simply held their ground, waiting. Somewhere deep beneath the stone, something shifted again, restless, restrained, denied the comfort of dreaming. The narrator felt it withdraw slightly, settling back into uneasy containment. The night stretched on, vast and unending, and for the first time since arriving, he understood that dawn was not a promise here. It was a test of endurance. And as the weight of the village's purpose settled fully onto his shoulders, the narrator realized that step 3 was no longer about learning the truth. It was about deciding whether he could survive it. The moment the narrator lifted his head and chose to remain standing, something fundamental shifted within the clearing. It was not dramatic, no sudden noise, no violent reaction, but subtle, undeniable realignment, as though the village itself had accepted his presence in a way it never had before. The hum altered its rhythm again, settling into a slower, deeper cadence that resonated less like a warning and more like acknowledgement. The villagers did not move closer, yet the space between them felt smaller, tighter, as if the circle had closed without a single step being taken. The narrator felt it first in his thoughts. The sharp edge of panic that had driven him since his arrival began to dull, replaced by a heavy, focused clarity. Fear did not disappear, but it transformed, becoming quieter, more controlled, like a tool rather than a reflex. His exhaustion remained, pressing down on him relentlessly, yet it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt expected, managed, as though the village had accepted his weakness as part of the process. The elder stepped forward again, closer this time. Still no words were spoken. None were needed. The narrator understood instinctively that speech was discouraged here. Not because it was forbidden, but because language had a way of loosening focus, of allowing the mind to drift. Instead, the hum carried meaning in a purer form, transmitting understanding without interpretation, without escape. The stone structure behind him pulsed again, stronger now, and the narrator felt something inside himself respond. Not excitement, not curiosity, recognition. A sense that this place had been waiting for him long before he had ever heard its name. Images surfaced in his mind, fragmented and disjointed. Faces he did not recognize. Nights without dawn. People standing in silence until their legs trembled, their eyes burned, their thoughts thinned to a single command. Stay awake. He realized then that the village did not recruit through force. It recruited through alignment. Those who could not endure were released, guided out before they broke. Those who could endure were reshaped. The villagers slowly shifted their stance, each one turning slightly toward the stone structure. The narrator followed their gaze, and for the first time, he noticed a faint seam running through the stone, almost invisible unless viewed from this exact angle. It was not a door. It was a boundary, a deliberate division between what was allowed to surface and what must remain buried. The narrator felt a wave of dread wash through him as he understood the true fragility of that boundary. Something beneath the village stirred again. This time it was not subtle. The ground vibrated faintly, just enough to be felt through the soles of his feet. The hum tightened instantly, responding like a restraining force, and the villagers straightened in unison, their focus sharpened, eyes fixed, bodies rigid with controlled alertness. This was not panic. This was response. This was what they had trained for their entire lives. The narrator's thoughts flickered dangerously. His body begged for rest with renewed desperation, exhaustion clawing at him harder than ever before. He understood the cruel elegance of it now. The thing below did not need to wake fully. It only needed one mind to slip, one moment of dreaming, one unguarded descent into unconsciousness. The entire system depended on denying that moment over and over again. A sharp pain bloomed behind the narrator's eyes as his vision blurred. His knees trembled violently, and he felt himself sway. Instinctively, several villagers leaned forward, not to catch him, but to observe. This was another test. Always another test. The hum surged through him again, not harshly this time, but with focused precision. His awareness snapped back into place, breath ragged, muscles screaming. He stayed upright. The ground vibration eased slightly. Whatever lay beneath had been denied again. The realization crushed him with its full weight. This was not a temporary roll. There were no shifts, no rotations, no relief. Wakefulness here was cumulative. Every hour endured strengthened the seal. Every lapse weakened it. The villagers did not sleep, because they could not afford to. Not tonight. Not ever. The elder finally raised a hand, not as a signal, but as a mark of transition. The villagers responded immediately, breaking the circle in a precise, practiced motion. Two of them stepped aside, revealing a narrow passage behind the stone structure, descending into darkness. Not downward into the earth, but inward, toward the heart of the village's purpose. The narrator's chest tightened. He understood what this meant. Observation was over. Choice had been made. What came next was commitment. He hesitated only briefly, the last remnants of his former life flickering weakly through his mind. Sleeping rooms, closed eyes, dreams that belonged only to him. They felt distant now, almost unreal. With a slow, deliberate breath, he stepped toward the passage. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the hum shifted once more, locking into a new pattern, deeper and more stable than before. The vibration beneath the village settled, restrained again. The villagers relaxed slightly, though none of them truly rested. They had gained something precious this night, reinforcement. As the narrator disappeared into the narrow passage, the clearing behind him returned to stillness. The stone structure stood silent once more, its surface calm, its purpose fulfilled for now. Above it all, the village remained awake, watchful, disciplined, enduring, and somewhere deep beneath the earth, denied the comfort of dreams yet again. Something ancient and patient turned slowly in its containment, and waited for the next moment of weakness. The passage narrowed as the narrator moved forward, the walls closing in just enough to make every breath feel deliberate. The hum followed him here as well, softer now, less commanding, yet impossibly present, like a distant heartbeat echoing through stone. There were no torches, no lamps, only a faint ambient glow that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It was not light meant to guide. It was light meant to observe. With each step, the outside world faded further from memory. The concept of time unraveled completely. Minutes lost meaning. The idea of dawn felt abstract, almost fictional. All that remained was awareness. Pure, unbroken, relentless. The narrator realized that this place did not punish sleep through violence or fear. It punished it through inevitability, by reshaping the mind until sleep no longer felt safe, until wakefulness became instinct. The passage finally opened into a small chamber beneath the village. It was empty except for a ring of smooth stone seats, worn down by countless bodies that had occupied them over centuries. No chains, no restraints, just space designed for endurance. The narrator understood immediately. This was where watchers were made, where people learned to exist without surrendering to unconsciousness, where individuality slowly dissolved into purpose. He sat, not because he was told to, but because his body demanded it. The stone was warm beneath him, alive. The hum settled into a steady rhythm that wrapped gently around his thoughts, guiding them, stabilizing them. His exhaustion remained heavy and constant, but it no longer felt chaotic. It had been given structure, direction. Images rose unbidden in his mind. Faces of watchers long gone, eyes open through endless nights, mind sharpened by refusal. They had not been heroes. They had not been martyrs. They had been necessary. The village above endured because they did. The world beyond remained unaware because they stayed awake. The narrator felt something inside him finally give way, not collapse, but release. Resistance faded. Fear softened. Acceptance took its place, heavy but calm. He understood now that leaving had never truly been an option. Even if his body had escaped the village, the knowledge would have followed him. Sleep would never have come easily again. Dreams would have felt dangerous. Awareness would have lingered like a curse. Here, at least, his wakefulness had meaning. The hum deepened slightly, responding to his acceptance. Somewhere far above, the village continued its quiet routines. Somewhere far below, something ancient remained denied the one thing it needed most. The balance held, for now. The narrator lifted his gaze, eyes burning, mind painfully clear. He did not know how long he would sit here. Days, years, a lifetime. It no longer mattered. Wakefulness was no longer a burden to endure. It was a duty to uphold. And as the night stretched endlessly onward, the village remained what it had always been. Not a place where no one ever sleeps, but a place where someone is always awake. The hum continued. The seal held, and the world beyond slept peacefully, never knowing how close it had come to dreaming itself into oblivion.